Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the briefing session of the Utah Board of Oil, Gas, and Mining, put on by the Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining, and we welcome those that are watching. We'll turn the time over to you, Director Baza.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. Welcome to your monthly meeting here in Salt Lake City. The briefing session this morning is going to be a full one. We have a couple of different presentations to offer you. The first is a report that has been 2 years in the making. And to do this briefing to you, we're going to introduce some people who are streaming live from Oklahoma City in the offices of the Groundwater Protection Council. And hopefully as a board, you've received a folder that has an executive summary of what we're referring to as the Groundwater Protection Council produced water report. There is also a flash drive in that folder that has the full report on it that you can download and read at your leisure. It is also available on the Groundwater Protection Council website, and you can view it that way also. This is the full report, and it is 312 pages long, I believe, and it has taken quite a bit of time, and we'll talk to you a little bit about how it is organized, how it is presented, what the key findings are. We're going to try to keep this to about 20-25 minutes and give you the opportunity to ask questions about the report. But I'm going to introduce, first of all, the leadership team that is sitting in Oklahoma City. The image that you're seeing is Mr. Mike Paik, who's on the right side of the screen. He's the executive director of the Groundwater Protection Council. In the middle, seated at the end of the table, is Ms. Shelley Chard, who is the director of the Oklahoma Water Quality Division of the Department of Environmental Quality. Shelley also served as my co-chair in the organization of the report. On the left side of the screen is Mr. Mike Nicholas, who is a staff member of GWPC and also was the project manager. So when we talk about having to herd the cats on this report, Mike Nicholas was doing the lion's share of that work. It involved quite a few different people from many different states, and so there was a lot of organizational dynamics that needed to occur in the 2 years. One of the first things we did as part of the report was to meet here in Salt Lake City at the DNR building. So what I'm going to do at this point is we have a set of slides that we'll go through one by one, and I will be controlling those slides. I know that we have a bit of an audio synchronization problem with Oklahoma City, and we'll try to work through that as we go. But you may hear some echoing taking place, but we'll do our best to try to make our way through this briefing. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn the time over to Mr. Paik to go through the first few slides here, and the time is yours, Mike. Hold on, Mike, we're not hearing.
We appreciate the opportunity, and we're excited to do. We're excited to have the opportunity to be with you today.
Can't hear you.
Is your audio okay?
Tyler? They have no audio.
Okay. Appreciate the opportunity. I apologize for the problems with the internet today, but we do appreciate your time, and I've had the opportunity to appear before you as a guest of John Baza's over the years and talk about a variety of things, and we're excited about telling you today about our produced water report. A very brief background on the Groundwater Protection Council. We are a national organization. We've been around for 38 years, and we are an organization of state agencies. And our board of directors are composed of oil and gas directors, and you see it there on your screen, like John Baza, and state water division directors like Shelley Chard, who's sitting next to me here this morning. Utah has been a longtime member of the Groundwater Protection Council, and we appreciate the support from the board and all involved in Utah. John Baza is a member of our board of directors, and John is also, as is Shelley Chard, members of our executive committee for the board of directors. So we appreciate Utah's and John's engagement at that level in this organization. The one thing I'd like to say about John and Shelley is this report would not have happened without them, and we would not be on this presentation with you today without their efforts. It's been a interesting 2 years, and as John told you, we've had a multitude of people engaged. I think others will give some reflection of who those people are, the types of people that were engaged. But to my point that without John Baza's effort and leadership as co-chair and Shelley Chard's leadership as co-chair, and I must give credit to our project manager, the report would not have happened. And we appreciate John inviting us all to Salt Lake City over 2 years ago to kick this off. And then briefly, we had study partners and underwriters of the report. The principal was the U.S. Department of Energy, so we obviously thank them. We also had support and some underwriting from the American Petroleum Institute and from the Environmental Defense Fund, and then the Groundwater Research and Education Foundation, which is a separate organization from the GWPC proper, but affiliated with it. So thanks to all, and I'm going to turn the program back over to John.
Okay, at this time, I'd like to introduce other members of the leadership team who aren't in the briefing today. But we have, along with myself and Shelley and Mike Paik and Mike Nicholas, we had module leaders. And the three modules, which you'll hear about in just a moment, are organized so that we can deal with individual sections of the report, and the module leaders have guided those discussions and the writing of those sections of the report as we went. We had the introduction in Module 1. Actually, Shelley and I took that on, and that covers basically the legal and regulatory framework that was necessary in order to study the issues that the report covers. Module 2 was basically looking at use of produced water within the oil field. And for that, the module leaders that we had were Scott Kale of the Ohio Division of Oil, Gas, Resources Management, and then Tom Kropatch of the Wyoming Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. They're also pictured in this photograph. In Module 3, we actually went outside of the oil field and looked at how beneficial use could occur in areas that we hadn't even dreamed of yet. It was probably the most visionary part of the report, and Shelley will go into detail in talking about that. But the module leaders for that section of the report were Ken Harris, who was the California Oil and Gas Supervisor, and then Nicole Saunders of the Environmental Defense Fund, who led up a lot of the writing effort on that. We did use contractors for the report as well. Michael Dunkel, who is now with a corporation called Worley, and John Vale, who is with Vale Environmental Consulting. Then, of course, the GWPC staff, you've already met Mike Paik and Mike Nicholas, but Erica Carr was also key to the report, and she was helpful in terms of a lot of the report organization, the slides that you're seeing today, the public outreach that we're doing on the report. She's basically the public information person for GWPC. Basically the public information person for GWPC. So the project timeline, as you heard, started a little over 2 years ago with a board resolution that was passed in April of 2017. This was the GWPC board that said we needed to have a study of this nature in order to address produced water from oil and gas wells in the United States. We had our initial work group meeting, as I said, in June of 2017 in Salt Lake City. The Module 1 draft went to the editor later that year. That was the part that Shelley and I worked on in October of 2017. By November of October of 2018. So that took us over a year to put that to the editor. Shortly after that, in November of 2018, the Module 2 draft went to the editor, and the Module 3 draft went to the editor in January of this year, and the Module 1 final draft went to the editor in February. Modules 2 and 3 went to the final in March of 2019. In April, our board approved the report in its entirety, and we went to publication in 2019. There was a lot of time spent in the writing. So between June of 2017 and when the Module 1 draft went to the editor a little over a year later, there was a lot of writing that went into this. And that's the part that Mike Nicholas was very involved in terms of getting people organized enough to produce the various modules of the report. But things went pretty rapidly starting in the fall of last year to our publication date. Our report goals. The GWPC hopes that this report will be used to educate the public, to encourage the oil and gas industry and also state and federal regulatory agencies to gather data on produced water. One of the things that we learned was that there's a lot of data out there, but it's not well organized and not well compiled. Some of it isn't even being reported to the states in that good of a manner. But we're hoping that the report will encourage more of this data gathering and data compilation to occur. We hope that it informs new research. There's a lot of areas of research that the report is recommending and suggests. Not all the questions can be answered with a study of this nature because it needs a lot of additional time in order to digest the information we've got to date and to understand where the areas need to be looked at. We hope also that this facilitates the use of the produced water in a manner that is protective of public health and the environment. Excuse me. The report organization. We mentioned that there's a table of contents, a preface, an executive summary. The folder that we've given you as board members has that executive summary in it. Shelley and I, again, were responsible for the introduction in Module 1. And then we had different leaders responsible for Module 2 and Module 3. As the writing of the report occurred, various appendices were included, and that is included in the report, and it is a large chunk of the report as it exists. I mentioned how the modules were set up. We have Module 1 as the regulatory and legal frameworks. We went out and looked at a lot of different states. We used a legal team out of Louisiana State University that looked at about 6 or 7 different states and tried to understand how are the regulations been developed in all of these states, and they provided us with some information that is included in the report. So it describes the legal and regulatory framework around the United States. What we did learn from that is that there are differences in all the states. It's hard to lump together a lot of consistencies from the states because all of their rules and all of their laws are just a little bit different. But we hope by having what we've included in the report, which is a survey of some major states, we can show that there are some distinct consistencies as well as differences that need to be looked at. Module 2 is more about produced water use in the oil field. And I'm really glad that we had the leadership we did, who are members of the regulatory communities in both Wyoming and Ohio. And it was needed in that way because the oil and gas industry is such a unique animal that we needed the experience from oil and gas regulators to be able to produce a report module of this nature. It required a lot of pushing and pulling with the oil and gas industry to get the information that we got from them. There's some good information in that module about the various producing basins in the United States. Again, it's hard to do a report like this, which is global across each of the United States, but we hope by looking at the major producing basins, again, it provided us with some consistencies and some differences that were good to look at. And then Module 3, as I said, is the most forward-looking, looking at how we could use produced water outside of the oil field. So I'll go over the key points of Module 1 and 2, and then I'll turn it over to Shelley. In Module 1, some significant key points we got, and we totally understand that states regulate oil and gas activity. Even though the federal government has its fingers in the pie, so to speak, with the BLM managing federal lands, the EPA doing regulation of various environmental issues, it is the states which have the ultimate responsibility to regulate oil and gas activity in each of the states. Water rights and responsibilities vary from state to state. We saw different laws and different rules being affected in each of the states, and there were some characteristics of the states that are discussed in the report that there's even a different culture in water than what we understand in the extractive industries. So we had to understand that in a key way to get the information out there. A third key point from this module is that considering produced water during state water planning will facilitate reuse. I think there's been a gap there. Some states have done it better than others. But I would have to say, even in Utah, we haven't incorporated the concept of oil field produced water into our state water planning efforts. It could be done a lot better, and we're hopeful that this report will motivate that to occur. And then the final key point from Module 1 is that the regulatory frameworks may need to evolve to facilitate reuse. There are some things which could be considered obstacles in the various states regarding reuse, and especially outside of the oil and gas oil field, we need to have some additional regulatory framework to make those things happen. The Module 2 key points, there are quite a few of them, as you can see. Cost is the key driver of reuse in the oil field. It is involved in the transport, the storage, the treatment of produced water. It can be used in both the completion operations that currently exist, as well as enhanced recovery that occurs in the oil field. But it can only be done if cost is taken into account. There are challenges and opportunities that affect reuse in the oil and gas industry. We understand those. I think the report presents a good summary of those things, but we cannot deny that there are challenges involved in that reuse. Produced water midstream, which is basically moving produced water from where it's produced to where it can be reused, is emerging as a water management strategy. We're seeing it a big way in West Texas, the Permian Basin. But when we talk about moving water, the costs on that, whether you pipe it, whether you truck it, whether it's a simple gathering system in a local area, are going to be key in determining how that water management strategy will apply. There are some research needs and policy initiatives that need to be addressed to expand produced water reuse in oil and gas operations. The report identifies some of those policy initiatives, and these are areas where boards like yourself or state legislators can take some recommendations and possibly apply in their individual states. And the final key point from this module is that reuse varies by region and area, and we need to understand that producing water in the Marcellus or in West Texas or in the Bakken of North Dakota is very different than any other state. So let's take that into account and use that as part of our discussion. So here are the key points for Module 3, and I'm going to turn some time now over to Shelley to go through Module 3 because it was the most forward-looking module and probably requires a little better comprehension about what's going on in that module. So I'll let Shelley take over at this point. Comprehension about what's going on in that module. So I'll let Shelley take over at this point.
And good morning. So happy to be here with you talking about this great effort. Module 3 had a particular set of challenges that we didn't really face in the first two modules, in that this was our looking forward opportunity. What do we know? What do we need to know? And what have we not even thought about to this point? Were areas that we tried to involve a lot of different types of stakeholders, different types of entities to work through these with us. Some of the key points that are takeaways from this module, reuse is minimal, but there's a lot of opportunities and we can expand. We just have to do it in a measured, appropriate, protective way. A key challenge for reuse of produced water outside of the oil and gas industry, we need some research done. We need a lot of research. There is a considerable amount of research out there, and in this module, we did a literature review of somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 to 700 papers. Those are included as a bibliography for those that are interested. We also have the summary of the types of research that we found that we think are pretty important in advancing our efforts of reuse of produced water. We developed a decision-making risk-based framework. This has been done many times for targeted areas. Sometimes it's very helpful to sit down and really look at what are the key decision points, and I'll talk a little bit more about that decision framework in a couple of slides from now. The level of treatment and the type of research that is needed really is going to depend on what the end use is of the produced water. We refer to this as fit for purpose. So we don't think all water needs to be treated to potable levels if you're going to be irrigating with it, for example, but it does need to be protective. So I think that's a key point. There are other practical issues that have to be considered, and that is the public participation. You want to make sure that the public is on board, the logistics, the transportation, the economics. What do the regulations look like in the various jurisdictions where the water reuse will occur, where the produced water is generated? All of those are critically important. And there definitely needs to be additional research. We're hopeful that research institutions, where they be colleges, universities, standalone foundations, industry groups, they can pick up Module 3 and look at some of the key areas and say, I'm going to do this kind of a project. I hope to answer these sets of questions. So going on to the next slide, we talk specifically about some of those research needs. And those, include what can we do to enhance produced water reuse. We need to identify options and emerging needs. What are the drivers in particular regions? We talk about in some areas, drought is a key driver. It may be the need for additional water for irrigation. It may be industrial uses, cooling tower use, those types of potential water reuse opportunities, and also recreational needs or environmental restoration are important points that we need to make sure we have the research before we move down that path. As John talked about, there are certain legal and regulatory questions that are need to be addressed. What does the permitting scheme look like? What is the ownership liability of produced water and its transportation and reuse? The public perception. If you have an adversarial relationship with the public, it's going to be much harder to do meaningful reuse. Building the infrastructure to move water, the treatment of the produced water, and of course, solids management or other residuals from treatment have to be addressed in a safe and appropriate manner. We need to expand our knowledge and the characterization of the produced water. We need to have appropriate analytical methods. We need to have appropriate laboratory capacity, testing, pilot studies, bench scales, field tests. We need to look at various options for the various end uses, and we need to develop and implement risk assessments for human health and the environment. The next slide is a high-level summary of a decision-based framework. If you look in the report, you will find many boxes and many alternatives based on answers to a whole series of questions. But really, it breaks down into 4 phases. And really, we're looking at the preliminary assessment of the program. Does it make sense? Does it solve a need? Then we start looking at identifying stressors, the potential entities that are impact, whether it's human health or it's environmental, and making decisions on is it a reasonable risk or what needs to be done. That's when we go into the phase 3, which is actually looking at the risk assessment for that use on those stressors. And then ultimately, we're looking at the evaluation of that risk and deciding, should we move forward with this project? Do we need additional research? Finally, when we start looking at practical considerations for produced water reuse, we kind of bring it all together. We're talking about legal and regulatory issues. John mentioned some of those earlier. The comprehensive water planning is a great tool to get the conversation going. That feeds into public perception. Do we have rules or state laws in place that impede the reuse of produced water? If so, how do we address those? How do we work with our community partners, our stakeholders, our landholders, mineral rights holders, whoever they might be, to get everybody on board, understanding the risks and the benefits? Sometimes we forget we have a lot of benefit gain from this additional water not being disposed. We look at reducing seismicity. In Oklahoma, we became the poster child for earthquakes. We're glad that we've been able to make some different decisions and reduce that seismicity. If we can help our very arid western part of our state deal with drought, that's a huge benefit. The logistics, getting everybody on the same page, trying to figure out how we can move this water cost effectively and make it a true resource rather than a waste project or product. Economics, at the end of the day, you've got to be able to fund the projects. You've got to be able to fund reuse. You have to be able to make it reasonably close in cost comparison to actual disposal rather than, we want that the resource benefit to show rather than simply the waste benefit. So with that, John, I will turn it to you for a few final comments.
This conclusion slide is really mostly for the Module 3 area, but things that we did learn about it is that reuse is possible and can be cost-effective in the right situations. Oil and gas companies and end users have to work together to facilitate this reuse. The regulators can look for ways to allow reuse projects, but must ensure that these practices are done with proper environmental and public health protection. And as my friend Mike Paik is fond of saying, in the end, as states, we all represent public health officers in protecting the public from harm. Finally, expanding reuse opportunities may require regulatory and legislative solutions. And as you can see there, that's what we would look for: ownership, transfer, determination of liability, human health and safety, and environmental risk and mitigation. The principal report conclusions are that produced water does have reuse, and it has local and regional potential, but requires some careful thought. I think this board is capable of that careful thought because you have the experience and knowledge of working with the extractive industries in this state. I think our legislators also have that careful reasoning ability, and we can guide them in that effort through reports that like this, and we're hoping that the recommendations from this report will be well considered at the state level. At this point, Mr. Chairman and members of the board, that concludes our presentation. We're happy to answer any questions. We'll turn the time back to you for a second.
Thank you very much. That was an outstanding presentation, and for those in Oklahoma, thank you for your input. This is a great step forward. It's not the final step, but it is certainly a great step forward, and we'd like to, as a board, to be involved in the next steps. So with that, Rich?
I just had a question on the, I assume most of these produced waters are saline, probably prohibitively saline for using in an untreated manner for irrigation or drinking water or, you know, environmental uses in stream flow restoration or something. What industrial uses have you found that you can put this water to that doesn't require expensive treatment?
I think obviously the biggest industrial use is within the oil field itself. But as this board knows, there are other extractive industries in mining that we probably haven't even touched the surface of and how this water could be used. You mentioned salinity. I'd be the first one to say that salinity is all over the map in the United States. Some of these waters are fresher than others. We saw some situations in California where California has actually created some state law to allow moderately or less saline water to be used for agricultural purposes. So we think the uses are out there depending on the level of treatment, and it does basically boil down to cost in most cases.
Any other questions? On the left, on the right, yeah, question? One of the big issues that my company looked at when we looked at produced water reuse was the, I don't know what we call it today, but it was kind of the sheen that you could get the water down to a certain point where it was usable, but you couldn't get that last little rainbow glow off the top of the water. Any ideas about that last step? That seems to be, in terms of the science of doing it, and certainly the public perception of it is a critical factor. Any ideas or comments on that?
You know, I would be glad to help answer that. I think we've got folks in Oklahoma who can help with that too. But, you know, I think that our goal in this was maybe not necessarily get it all the way to the point of human consumption or other freshwater uses. But if we can take the huge volume of produced water that's coming out of the oil field and at least displace some of the current uses of fresh water, that creates a lot more fresh water available for human consumption. So that final sheen may be difficult to get at, and it may not be that we can ever truly get at it in a manner that's going to be pleasing to everyone, but I think that we can get it good enough, if you know what I mean.
Final question from me, and that has to do with the legal side of it. Most water that is of a state or a legal subdivision is owned by the government and then is allocated on a statewide basis. Is there any movement anywhere in the country where you've seen the oil and gas regulators take the first step to be able to look at this as kind of a holistic approach where because it's produced water, it's regulated by the oil and gas regulators and then put to reuse applications?
Mike, you have the most national view because you see activities in all the states. I hope you heard the question. Why don't you take a crack at answering that from your perspective as a national director? He's in all the states. I hope you heard the question. Why don't you take a crack at answering that from your perspective as a national director?
Sure. I think that there are a number of state oil and gas regulatory agencies that are taking a more comprehensive look at produced water and in working in partnership with the water purveyors in a particular state. I think that that is more indicative of Western states, which shouldn't surprise anyone because of the ongoing drought conditions. But I do see activity in the different state oil and gas agencies, and we'd be happy to identify them. But I think of Wyoming, for one, comes immediately to mind. New Mexico comes to mind immediately. California, and there are actually some eastern states. We're certainly open to the opportunities here in Oklahoma through both our Department of Environmental Quality, who has a number of permitting responsibilities, but then our Corporation Commission, our equivalent to your board, is now with the production of this report has begun taking a closer look. So that activity is occurring, and I would encourage, Mr. Chairman, Utah has been on the cutting edge here with this report, and your support of John and all that went into the report. And we'd love to be of any assistance we can in the months or years going forward to help Utah enter into that discussion to the degree you might be interested in doing it. Shelley, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I think that pretty well sums it up. I know different states, different approaches with their groundwater, and that sometimes dictates who has the right of ownership or the responsibility for transportation and treatment of that water. I think there's always opportunity for better coordination and looking at how different states have approached the problem. I think we are starting to see more discussions, at least in Oklahoma and Texas, on how we deal with that ownership versus water rights versus liability and transportation.
Thank you so much. That was very, very helpful. Director Baza, if I think I can sense maybe a feeling of the board, is there a chance we could meet with, say, our counterpart board in the water arena?
I think that would be very helpful, and I can make arrangements to see that happen.
And then could you help us moderate that in terms of focusing in on the displacement of freshwater to applications where this might be possible, and then at least have a discussion of 4 or 5 of the key points that came up on the presentation today? Thoughts?
I think that would be a perfectly appropriate action with this release of this report, that we move forward and say, how are we going to put this into play here in the state of Utah?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, we might want to even offer an invitation to a couple of key legislators to at least come and listen.
Indeed.
Thank you. Thank you all for your input and for this critical work that's being done. I really can't imagine many projects in our country that can be as important or more important than this in terms of the long-term economics and benefits to the people of our country. So thank you again. Very much appreciated.
Thank you, friends in Oklahoma, and we'll allow you to sign off at this point, and we'll continue with our briefing.
Thank you again. Very much appreciated.
Thank you, friends in Oklahoma, and we'll allow you to sign off at this point, and we'll continue with our briefing.
Thank you all very much for the opportunity.
Mr. Chairman, with that, we're going to move forward to item number 2 on the briefing agenda. I'm hoping I've left enough time for our guest. When we went through the Environmental Excellence Award considerations for the nominations we'd received, the board was fairly impressed with a company that was nominated named EcoVap. And here today, we have a representative of EcoVap to give us a presentation about their project and their process. And I'll turn the time over to Jason Mendenhall, who is a representative of the organization. I think we may need a little time just to change over our computer here.
Board members, may I make a recommendation to you? This is important enough and is cutting edge enough. I think we need to take the time to really understand this and move forward. With your permission, we'll just continue this till and it may go past the 10 o'clock time. Any concerns about that? Anyone in the audience, if we go slightly over 10 o'clock, does that put you in any sort of travel or other problems? Seeing none, then let's go forward and and listen to this. This is we were impressed, and we would like to know more, and so we're excited to have you here today, Jason, and appreciate your comments.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having us, and thanks for this opportunity. We really appreciate it. We've been busy and hard at work, and taking out a little bit of time is we appreciate the opportunity to do that. My name is Jason Mendenhall. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of EcoVap. I'm a chemical engineer by training from the great University of Utah up the road here, with a background in industrial technologies and building companies and taking them to market. We've been doing EcoVap as a company that specializes in the treatment of industrial wastewater, and we focus on using biomimicry technologies, right? So our goal has always been to say, how can we mimic the way that Mother Nature works to handle processes that would normally need to be done either chemically or otherwise in order to help mitigate the industrial wastewater space. And so biomimicry has become a big key part of the way that we operate. A little bit about our background. We're a Utah-based company founded by a local engineer, an aeronautical engineer named Mike Patey. If you do a web search for Mike Patey in aviation, you will see his background. He is world-renowned in what he does, understands fluid dynamics, aerodynamic principles, structural engineering, and has created quite a few companies that have been built from the ground up. We are a group of problem solvers. We're entrepreneurs. that have been trying to solve problems in various industries our whole careers, and that's what we love. And the way that EcoVap started is kind of an interesting story. Mike was visiting the fields of the Uinta Basin with some friends of his, and while he was out there, and these were folks that owned oil and gas fields, and while he was out there visiting with them, he said, hey, what's your biggest problem out here? Which is the #1 question an entrepreneur asks, right? Do you got a problem? Can I solve it? And they said, man, if we could figure out how to get rid of water, things would be so much better for us out here. And he went, great. And so we started down that process. And in looking at the market, we found kind of some interesting things. When we looked at the treatment of industrial wastewater, which is actually in probably a lot of these details that you're going to see today that we're talking about and the way we got developed actually sits in the report that was developed by this commission. We saw a market share where about 90% of the things were being put into injection wells or being injected back into the ground. About 5% was this idea of adjustment and reuse. And then about 5% was evaporation, which is really the interesting thing. Evaporation is Mother Nature's way of cleaning water. That's the way Mother Nature has been doing it since the day the earth was created. And yet it only represented a small amount of the market. Injection wells, a big part of the market because it's kind of an easy way to solve the problem. Let me take this water and inject it back into the ground. And it has its benefits, but it also has its downsides that we recognize. The other problem we saw with adjustment and reuse was a lot of the issues that were talked about today. The cost is astronomical. And at a certain level, you can only reuse and treat water so many times before it is actually untreatable and unusable. That's the sheen that you're talking about, not just the physical part of it, but there's a chemical property of water that prevents it from continuing to be reused. And so we looked at this and we said, you know what, there's actually a problem in the market and there's a gap, because if so much of it is being used in this one way, i.e. injection wells, and this is industry-wide, not just in oil and gas, but in mining and other areas, there has to be a better way. One of the challenges with injection wells that we saw when we looked at it is that it doesn't eliminate one of the biggest problems in getting rid of water, which was brought up in that report, and that's transportation. Right? If you drive out to the Uinta Basin, or you drive out to the Permian, or you drive out in Oklahoma, you will see an army of trucks transporting water to either disposal facilities or injection facilities. The energy requirements for injection well are actually relatively high. The additional concerns with injection wells that we saw when we were saying, hey, is there a better way to do this? Is that when it comes to injection wells, one of the challenges is the risk of freshwater contamination, which is happening in New Mexico, it's happened in Louisiana, it's starting to happen in Oklahoma, where they're finding chemical traces in freshwater aquifers of water that's been injected into the ground and kind of represents a significant risk. The other one that's been talked about frequently in the injection well is seismicity, right? So these were problems that we saw, and then we said, hey, if we're going to target this, let's target the evaporation space, because it's underutilized, it's a way to do it, and it's Mother Nature's way of accomplishing this. And that started us down a path of developing a technology that, frankly, has been a game changer in the way that we've been operating. It's our evaporative matrix. So we started down this process, and we've created a patent-pending low-energy technology, and we can evaporate water at greater than 59 times the rate than faster than pond surfaces. So if you think about it, if you had a pond that was 400 feet by 400 feet, and you took the surface area of that pond and you replaced it with our technology, that pond would evaporate as if you had built 60 of those ponds or that equivalent. So we reduce the land use that's being used as it relates to getting rid of water. We accelerate the evaporative process, and we do it in a natural way. Now, we've never believed or thought that our technology would ultimately eliminate all other ways of wastewater disposal. At the end of the day, our goal has been to add optionality into the water supply chain, because the current methods just don't provide enough variability, enough options for us to solve this problem. One of the ways this technology works, and this is the interesting part of it, is we've actually figured out a way to make water stick to walls, and that's the best way to put it. I brought a sample of our technology. It's basically comprised of 2x2 panels that are molded using HDPE. So we actually take product from the oil industry, as my wife pointed out. She said, wait, you take stuff that comes from the oil industry and use it to make the product that's going to help get rid of the water from the oil industry? And I said, yeah, that's pretty much what we do. But these 2x2 panels, in essence, allow water to be vertically suspended in air. And so what we're doing is we're taking the surface area of that pond and we're extrapolating it thousands of times higher so that it can be exposed to air longer, and so that it can be exposed to more air, and thus accelerating evaporation. We've had outside firms come in and validate the work that we're doing in this space and our technology, a group called Golder, which is well known in the mining industry. And they came out, performed a test, did all the magic where they create this controlled environment, and we were 50 times more efficient than the same surface area of a pond. So at the end of the day, it reduces the land use, and most importantly, takes trucks off the road. Because one of the ways that we can deploy this, we've got multiple use cases in the way that we meet the needs. So we're not just catering to oil and gas, we cater to mining, we cater to power generation, we cater to anyone who might be trying to get rid of water in some way. In certain cases where we've seen mine tailing ponds, we've been asked to come in and help accelerate the evaporation of the water so it can get to a solid state, so we can eliminate that tailing pond and have it be gone forever, as opposed to just waiting for years and decades in order for those things to be evacuated. In the oil and gas industry, one of our big value adds is that we take those trucks off the road, because we have a unique ability to build our infrastructure, our evaporative matrices, right at the wellhead. So right where the water comes out, we can actually take it there and get rid of most of the water before it gets put in a truck and transported to an injection well or transported to a facility. We can also reduce the fixed asset investments that are put in, that are significantly put in some of these locations in order to treat this. Because it doesn't matter what you do, even if you're reusing, even if you're adjusting the water and over, at the end of the day, there is still some water that you have to get rid of. And by doing this, we're allowing it to return to Mother Nature, return to the air, and become part of the natural hydrologic cycle as a part of that. A couple things that we've been doing. So a couple ways that we deploy, we own water disposal facilities out in the Uinta Basin. That's how we got into the business, as problem solvers rather than just sitting in a lab somewhere and trying to figure out how does this work and what are the issues with the industry. We invested in a water disposal facility in the Uinta Basin and got into the business. And we used it as our test bed. What are the issues in the industry? How can we solve those issues? Let's put our technology to work in a commercial application. And in essence, what you're looking here is our dike EcoVap EM, where this tower, in essence, is built, a wall, is built on the neighboring ground next to the evaporative ponds. And in essence, we've reduced the land use to get equivalent evaporation by 96%, and most importantly, we reduced the CapEx by 50%. The capital expenditure required to get rid of equivalent water, we cut that by 50%. This is one example of what we've done. In fact, if you would like to take a road trip, we'd be happy to have you out there, and you can show a road trip out to the Uinta Basin is always a good day, because you can go to the Hideout Steakhouse in Mighton, and you can make a good day of it. This is an example in Texas. So we've been working with an oil and gas company in Texas. In this particular location, they had a problem. There is a truck that goes through the farmer's land over 50 to 100 times a year, transporting water from that particular oil well to a disposal facility. Farmer's not too happy about it. The producer isn't too happy about it. The costs are significantly high as a result of it. If you look at the photo, you'll see there we built one of our evaporative matrices right next to that wellhead. This is where we've taken those trucks off the road and we've reduced their overall costs. And if you notice from the picture, the land is greener, the sun is brighter, food tastes better. So we can transform industries across the board. It's actually a really funny story, because we had a season change while we were building this, and the before picture really looks bad. It is gray, it is brown, it is kind of ugly. And then all of a sudden spring came and the sun was setting and we had the drone up in the air and our guy took this photo and we thought, man, boy, we can really change ecosystems, can't we? But the benefit of this, with this being on site, again, we've taken the truck transport off the road. We've taken a 95% reduction in truck transport. That reduces increases the safety issue, because it reduces the number of trucks on the road, and is significantly reducing their costs, because they're not having to deal with that transport, and the majority of the water is getting rid of right there on site. You may ask, why couldn't you take all the trucks off the road? Well, if you think about what we are, we're a little bit of a concentrator. So as we evaporate water, there are solids that are still left. That saline that you asked about, that's the part that never leaves. And they can vary from 10,000 parts per million down in Texas to 200,000 parts per million up in North Dakota. That's the part that never leaves. That's the part that we take and that's the part that we still have to transport off. But that 95% reduction in truck transport has been a significant benefit, and we've been working with the Railroad Commission in Texas on this first deployment so they can kind of see it and get the regulatory processes in step. Another example is our float EcoVap evaporative matrix. And in this particular case, this is a mining company who is restricted by their land use. And they had to figure out a way to get rid of more water because they are a zero discharge facility, which is really common in the mining and utility industry. And as a zero discharge facility, that means that they have to make sure that their water can get taken care of right there on site. They're not allowed to put it in any rivers. They're not allowed to transport it off. They're not allowed to dump it in any other locations. They are responsible for their water for the end of time. In fact, they have a 200-year plan on their water treatment. Even after the mine shuts down, they're going to continue to have to manage that water that's there as a result of the mining efforts. In this particular case, we augmented their existing pond infrastructure by building directly on top of the ponds themselves. And by building directly on top of the ponds themselves, we've increased their capacity by over 30%, just by covering one small portion of it. They didn't have to build an additional pond. They didn't have to build additional take up additional land use, and they're also increasing the returns and the yields on their product, because the more fresh water that they can use, the better yields they get on their product. That's making them more profitable and allows them to produce more materials, and it eliminates the idea that they have this wastewater issue that could be there forever. Again, we're evaporating it, we get it down to a solid state, and helps reduce that. So each of these are each different examples of the way that we're being used in the industry today. Some of them are one on our own, others are areas where we're targeting other states. We have projects active in Montana, Wyoming, New Mexico, Texas, and California. And in each of these areas, these active projects with commercial entities have all been driven by one of these value propositions that I've talked about in the way that we're doing it. When you look at the environmental benefits, and this is the eye chart of the century, so I'm not going to try and cover all of this and read through everything, but every one of these technologies, whether it's injection disposal, thank you, conventional evaporation ponds, or the thing that nobody likes, conventional evaporation with atomizing sprayers, where they're essentially spraying the water into the air, which is used throughout the industry, but not ideal because it sprays salt all over the place. They've had farms and forests destroyed as a result of that. Each one of these has a place in the industry, and they have some benefits. One of the things that we've learned with our technology as we've gone out and targeted this is when you employ biomimicry and you figure out a way to get it to scale effectively, in almost every area you produce a benefit of some sort or another. And you'll see that as you look down the column on the far right. As with all great companies, we exceed, we always are up and to the right? All good companies go up and to the right. And that's exactly what we found in everything that we're doing. Whether it's reduced air pollution, whether it's reduced transport, reduced land print use, reduce earthquake risk, allowing for residual oil capture, allowing for capture of water mining extra salts and solids that are left after, paraffins, oxygenated water, you name it. In every one of those cases, we're actually exceeding the other aspects of it. The one area that we'll always be limited in is just that we can only evaporate so much. We're doing this without using the influx of any energy. So this is not an enhanced evaporation where we're putting energy into the process. The only thing we are doing is pumping water to the top of our matrix and then allowing Mother Nature to take over. And we're giving an opportunity for Mother Nature to be accelerated. As we look at our long-term goals and where we're heading, we're going to continue to expand our business. We're targeting areas where the regulatory environment is forcing companies to look at things differently. As a point of note, one of the challenges we've seen in Utah is the regulatory environment is kind of letting people do what they want, and it favors the producers. As a result of that, new technologies are hard to introduce into the process because the cost to dispose in traditional ways is being kept so low that new technologies don't have an opportunity to win or succeed. We're seeing that in California, we're seeing it in Texas, we're seeing it in New Mexico, we're seeing it in Wyoming, where they're actually putting boundaries on the process in order to cause them to facilitate and look at different options. We represent a significant optionality in that process. And like I've said, we didn't change Mother Nature, we just made her faster. And along the way, we've been having great success. We're still in the early stages as a company. Our commercial efforts are just brand new, but the results we're seeing are tremendous, and it's producing a lot of value across the board. Our team's local. Some of the folks you'll know, you may recognize from industries before or heard their name in various areas. Others, we're just entrepreneurs looking to solve a problem. So I want to open the floor to any questions you have. And again, thank you for the opportunity to talk. And if you'd like to have the panel and touch and see it, I'm happy to bring it up for you.
Thank you very much. We'll start with you, Mr. Brown.
Jason, thank you. When I saw the picture, the first thing I thought of was VOCs or apps. And you say they're very little, but are they in quantities that require you to seek an air permit?
No, they, in essence, because we're dealing with the water that's still being transported, the VOCs are the same or less than any current processes. So for instance, let's say a truck shows up and picks up that water and transports it. You've got two VOC problems there. Independent of the water itself, think of the air pollution being created by the truck driving down the road. And secondly, while that water is sitting in that tank and driving down the road and sloshing around, it is putting their VOCs into the air as the truck transports. And so in several cases, we've actually tested the VOCs as a result of the evaporation. And because if you're at a traditional wastewater treatment facility, that water is actually being treated before it goes into the evaporation process, we're following that. Or if we're at the wellhead, there's a natural process occurring where the VOCs are being limited because of the aeration that occurs by water dropping down our process. So we're seeing less than what the traditional approach is, and we're seeing that it's manageable where you've got it in a situation where it might be high. So yeah, not really an issue.
Thank you.
Great question.
So some parts of the year it's kind of cold out there. How as soon as it freezes, are you done? I mean,
We're not done. So the great thing about water coming out of the ground in the oil and gas industry is that it actually generally will come out at a pretty high temperature. And so we do have operating parameters whereby we can't operate, but we design our systems and our processes in such a way so that we account for that. So for instance, in the summer months, we might evaporate 3 to 4x what we might do in the spring or the fall. And so as we look at an annual balance of water that we're going to eliminate, we design our systems in such a way so that we're looking at it from an annual basis. We might even have some on-site storage that allows for that during that period of time, or it's during those months that we might not see trucks being removed from the road. We still might have to do some transport to a facility during that time, but the main goal of it is ultimately to take those trucks off the road, eliminate the danger associated with that, eliminate the air pollution associated with those trucks. And so on an annual basis, regardless of what the issues are, whether we're only operating 6 months out of the year, 8 months out of the year, we're able to have a huge benefit as a result of it. It's great.
where's your current facility out there?
What's that?
Where's it at?
It's just outside of Mighton. Yeah, outside of Mighton, about 2 to 3 miles west of Mighton, in the middle of nowhere. You go to the middle of nowhere, turn right, and then take a left, and it's right there.
On the left here, Rich?
So I assume as you're evapco-concentrating the solutes that are in the water, do you reach a point where the salinity gets so high that the process starts to lose efficiency? Is that when you got to ship the water off when it gets to a certain brine?
Yeah. So there's a certain point where solids are in suspension, and then at about 250,000 parts per million, solids start binding and they start dropping out of the water. And so that's the part, we like to keep it in that physical solid state. That's the part that we will generally transport out. It's not so much that it becomes inefficient, it's just that the solids are settling out and there's not really any more water. That's when you see, if you see an evaporation pond, you see that cake start to develop on top of it. Those are those solids that are settling down. The benefit of us is that we're a concentrator. When you really look at it, as we're evaporating water, and those concentrated salts have value to a lot of folks. And so in many cases, one of the challenges with treating that kind of a disposal is that there's too much water in the process. It's expensive to get that water out, and they can't extract the minerals that might actually be present in those solids. Because we can eliminate the water at a very cost-effective and rapid rate using natural processes, that solid then has a value to them. But we're always dealing with the influx of new water, so it's not a closed-loop system where we evaporate for a while and then it goes away and then we stop. There's always new water coming in, and it's that process that we're managing as part of our technology.
Susan?
You mentioned there's a value in some of those solids. What kind of minerals that are valuable in those solids?
It ranges everything from rare earth materials, so we're seeing folks looking to extract lithium out of there. There's salt brines that are actually valuable in increasing the salinity of certain waters in the oil and gas industry. There's a water called heavy water that they like to create that actually allows them to process a little bit better. Those salts that are there give them an opportunity to do that. And then there's paraffins, waxes, other things that are just part of the process that are remainder there, and being able to remove those and then reuse them is kind of a key conversation we're having with folks today. No one's really actively engaged in that right now, but it is the things that they're talking about. One of the challenges with that, when you talk about reuse in the oil and gas industry and you talk about distributed processes, one of the challenges is aggregating enough volume of that material so that you can actually get some cost-effective benefit out of the extraction of that. And so that's the conversations we've been having with some of our initial customers because they see the value in it. Because right now today, the stuff gets transported to a disposal facility, it gets injected into the ground, never to be seen again, or it's being distributed to a disposal facility where it's being put in an evaporation pond and they never have access to it again. So the fact that they have access is kind of spawning that innovative thinking and a different way to look at it. Everyone agrees that the challenge with injection wells is that you take usable water, you use it in a process, and then you inject it into the ground and that water is never to be used again. One of the values that we bring and people are talking about is our ability to get the water back to the hydrogeologic cycle as opposed to just having it disappear forever.
Second thoughts, other questions? Thank you very much. We sure appreciate that.
Thank you. Appreciate the time.
Jason. Back to you, Director Baza.
Mr. Chairman, I just have two quick items that I'd like to mention to you. One is that this past month, I was able to go to the ESRI Users Conference with Tom Thompson in San Diego, where because of the work Tom's been doing with GIS and drone technology, we actually won a Special Achievement Award from the organization at this Users Conference. And to put it in perspective, we were noted that out of the, well, couple hundred awards that were given, that represents probably 1/100% of the total users throughout the world of GIS software from this company. So we were pretty proud to accept the award and shake the hands of the organization's founder in that conference.
Well done. Thank you very much for that. We recognize that. So that everyone knows who Tom is, would you just wave your hand violently? Thank you very much for what you're doing on that.
The last thing I'll mention to you is that we got a notice from administrative rules that some of our rules were up for expiration, and they had sent us notification of that at the end of last year, and it got misplaced, overlooked, and we were under a deadline to get these rules renewed. So Natasha Balif went ahead and submitted the forms for renewal of these rules. They include 3 of our coal rules, 105, which is blaster training, examination, certification, part 106, exemption for coal extraction incidental to the extraction of other minerals, and part 400, which is inspection of enforcement, division authority of procedures, and then our part 10 rules under R649, administrative procedures. I know this was something we normally bring to the board and say, we need to go ahead with renewal and then have a discussion as to whether any of the rules need to be changed. But this one was coming up for a time certain deadline of August 5th. And so we got that form back into administrative rules. I think we're good to go, and then we can certainly take a look at those rules and brief you in the coming months as to whether any of those rules need adjustment at this point. But we were under a deadline and we went ahead and did it, and we beg your forgiveness in not letting you know that soon enough. So that's all we had for you today, Mr. Chairman. We'll turn the time back to you.
Thank you very much. You know, it's a delight to come to the briefing session and hear about national awards that this agency and its employees continue to receive. And with that, one final matter, and that is the opportunity for public comment. Is there anyone here that would like to address this board on anything that dealing with our jurisdiction? Seeing none, then while we get set up for the formal meeting, we're going to take about a 7-minute break. And we'll let the court reporters and the technical folks take care of that. Is that enough time? Okay, thank you. So we're on break.